name is I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Life Relief Development, and I'd like to welcome you to this fundraising event, dinner, on behalf of the children and families of Gaza. Life Relief and Development has been working for the last 21 years across the globe to provide humanitarian assistance to the needy, the orphans, the people that are victims of natural disasters, of conflicts, and of poverty in general. Early on, we started providing humanitarian assistance to the people of Iraq throughout the 1990s, and we expanded our humanitarian operations to include other countries like Jordan, the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan, and then we moved on to Syria, and then in Palestine we established an office in Nazareth, where we do, which is inside Israel, and is licensed by the Israeli government. We provide humanitarian assistance to the people in the West Bank and Gaza, and we've been doing that for over the last 10 years, and we've established many humanitarian programs in Palestine, including building clinics, establishing and rebuilding some schools, in addition to family assistance, providing basic humanitarian support such as food, water, and medical kits and medical supplies. In addition, we've expanded our operations to include other countries, such as in Africa, West Africa, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Horn of Africa, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other parts of the world. The reason we're here is for the people of Palestine, people of Gaza specifically, because of the suffering that they have endured, and specifically because of the recent events that happened in Gaza, as you are all aware of. Life Relief and Development is a licensed nonprofit, tax-exempt charity, and as such, we are non-political, non-governmental, because our mission is a humanitarian mission. We are there to provide sustenance for every human being that we can support and we can assist who is in need, from the child to the widow to indigent families who are in dire need of assistance. And we are pleased to partner with members of the community and community organizations to be able to provide assistance to the people of Gaza. And it's through the generous donations and support of our community and the supporters of life that we are able to provide this humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza as well as others around the world. And as such, tonight, this evening, we have very generous speakers who have given their time to speak about Gaza. And as a non-governmental, non-political organization, the views that are reflected by the speakers do not necessarily reflect those of Life or its staff. And as a non-political, non-governmental organization, our effectiveness is through carrying out our humanitarian mission, irrespective of any political view or any views of anyone who wants to support Life. And as such, we generously thank all those who are attending and are supporting this event. And I would like to introduce our Master of Ceremony, Sister Sihan Chapa, who will be able to introduce our guest tonight, and later on we will see a video of Life's humanitarian mission in Gaza and in Palestine in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muhammad. And I'm honored to be here with all of you for this humanitarian effort as well. I want to welcome you all here this evening, and we as a community, as a state, and as a nation need to be informed, and we need to take an active role in ensuring that we do the right thing. This has certainly been a foggy and gray area, and when it comes to human aid and civil rights especially. I want to thank the organizers of this amazing event, first and foremost, photographer and activist Nafi Abnab. Please give them a round of applause. Dr. Nidal Jabour, Dr. Lasan Saeed, Dr. Jiab Slayman, and pharmacist Nabil Faki, NAMA, National Arab American Medical Association, and of course Life for Relief and Development. And thank you to all the sponsors listed on the banner. It's your gifts and your generosity that will make a difference in Gaza. And thank you to the volunteers, Afaf Ahmed, Lisa Saad Hafizi, Rima Abu Araibi, and there's so many more. Please give them a round of applause. There's certainly a special tribute and very special thanks goes out to Dr. Jiab Slayman, who is providing medical care and surgical care in Gaza as we speak now. He put it upon himself to go on the ground and be part of the process. So please, in absentia, give him a round of applause. He's serving 10,000 civilians who have been injured or maimed by the brutal atrocities against the Palestinian people. Our hearts go out to the families of the 2,000 people that have perished as a result of Israeli aggression. I want to remember a very, very special young lady whose courage and conviction has resonated through our hearts and throughout the world. Rachel Corey gave her life defending a Palestinian home which was to be demolished by an Israeli bulldozer. She stood against aggression, and we will never, ever forget. Welcome to We Are Gaza. When you think of persecution, when you think of lack of civil liberties, inhumane living conditions, as well as families living in fear without the basic necessities that should be afforded to every human being, unfortunately, we have to think of Gaza and the Palestinian people. And tonight, we have a simple, yet heartfelt and poignant program for you. One that will enlighten you, touch you, and hopefully effectively give you the tools to put into perspective the complex struggle and underlying conditions behind the struggle of the people of Gaza and its Israeli neighbors. You will hear from our own Imam Muhammad Ramzini, Father Rani Abdul Masih, publisher Usama Sablani, and our keynote speaker this evening, the outspoken and the well-spoken Miko Peled. Thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. I'd like to introduce to you a gentleman who has been a voice of reason, a voice of peace, a voice of moderation, and an individual whose spiritual essence has touched most of us, if not all of us in this room. Imam Mardini is one of 49 men in Michigan who holds a position of leadership in the faith of Islam. His gentle sermonizing, whether on subjects of personal or religious importance, equates to his most sincere and his most basic message. We must all work together with open hearts and understanding. His lesson of communion is paralleled by his fierce resistance to the actions of those who commit violent acts in the name of God. And he is outspoken in condemning those acts and individuals who perpetrate them. He is the leader of the American Muslim Center in Dearborn, chaplain for the State Prison of Southern Michigan in Jackson. Please help me welcome Imam Muhammad Mardini.
Thank you so much. And let me greet you with a greeting of peace. May the peace and blessing of God, the Almighty, God the Creator, who created us and created everything in this life for us, so we may live and enjoy and be righteous. The wound of Palestine, not just only Gaza, been bleeding for 66 years. Before it was a wound for our cousins, the Jewish families. After the World War, the entire international community stood together to serve humanity and help those they've been oppressed, and welcome them in their own homes and help them for every bit of resources, because they've been oppressed and justly dealt with and forcefully. What we call the international world at that time tried their best to raise up above all the discriminations. But after that, we come through the easement of politics to see another suffering. For the innocent people, they did not do the world any wrong. They were farmers, neighbors, humble men and women, cared for their own families. They've been uprooted by a superpower, dealt with unjustly, wiped the whole villages for the tactic of terrorism. And they placed them everywhere you and I might know, in camps rented by the United Nations temporarily, so that they will go back to live in their own homes. Many of them still carry the key, and they have the deeds. And generation after generation, they tell them that you have to be back. Not because it is a piece of territory, but because it is a blessed area where God, the Creator, blessed it for generation after generation and sent a chosen prophet to the chosen people to be settled in peace, justice, and equality. Over the years, we hear that people are going to come and provide a solution. But until today, as we are meeting here in the free world, we seeing, hearing, and listening to the atrocity. That we can do what we can to stop it. We can raise a voice, awareness. For the sake of God, the most gracious, most merciful, we could volunteer to stop the bloodshed that God Almighty told us about it in the divine revelations. Awareness that we all Gaza, not the land only that we care for, but the human. That God Almighty said to all of us that the children of Adam, all of them, are honored. And we have a duty to stand together to prevent any harm. Today, the harms, the killing, the bloodshed is over there. Tomorrow, for any other reason will be some other places. So we call him today and every day. On those they have a heart, those they have a soul, those they know that this life is not really a just life. The divine justice is going to be later. But for our sake, we have to work together for peace, for justice, for equality to all. For the people of Gaza, we pray and we cry to God Almighty to restore peace and understanding, and have those in the position of making decisions to do the best to save lives and stop bloodshed. But the urgent need today from all of us to extend a hand and heart and try to do our best by every means to help raise a voice, raise awareness, and try to reach out there to help stop the bloodshed and stop the crying of the children, the angels, that they did no atrocity to anyone, to stop the tears of our women, children, elderly, clergy, whoever are there. It is our obligation, it's a human obligation, it is a religious obligation, spiritual obligations, political obligations, economical obligations. It is an obligation for each and every one of us to stand tall and help, because this is the most that they need at this time. So again, I thank you all for coming in today on Thursday, the busy day, leaving all your busy schedule behind you, and come here to listen to a journey of peace, to listen to a prayer that might humble our hearts, to make a commitment to work for peace, justice, and equality for all. May God bless you and may God reward you. And as we are going to partake the food together, I want you to remember those children that they have no water, they have no electricity, they have no piece of bread, they have no safety. So let us pray for peace and cry to God the Almighty, who created us from a single male and single female, and make us tribes and nations, that we may recognize the rights of each other and deal in kindness with each other, and the best among us, the best to humanity. So I pray that God the Almighty protect each and every one of you and your family, and pray to empower us to stand tall for peace, justice, and equality. God bless you and thank you.
I think recognizing each other's rights are the key words there. But in order to do so, we need a balanced playing field, and that's what we need to work towards. Thank you, Imam Mardini, for those words. The similarities between faiths is prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, and ethical values, and it is pertinent that we all work together for the social message of our faiths collectively, and that is ultimately for peace and for justice. I saw a statement that read, and I love this statement, diversity is a divine design, and it is for us to know each other, build bridges of understanding, promote peaceful coexistence, and set an example for tolerance, respect, and cooperation, but we need an equal player as well. Having said this, it is my pleasure to introduce to you a man of faith, a man of peace, and an individual who's truly devoted his life as a man of God to promoting understanding, to build bridges, and create a conversation around how we are all the same, all the children of one God, and we all have a common goal to promote peace, understanding, and certainly fairness among our brothers and sisters of all faiths, of all denominations and cultural backgrounds, and across the barriers that unnecessarily divide us. He's created and implemented many conferences, many opportunities for people of various faiths to come together and to find the ultimate common ground that we all share. It is my honor to introduce to you the leader and inspiration of Mother of the Savior Church, in Dearborn, Father Ronnie Abdel-Messiah. Father.
Thank you, Sam. You know, they never make them my height, so I have to do this. Thank you, Sam, for the introduction. And again, you know, I just no longer know what organization you work for. I've seen you over all these years. You've introduced me in different capacities at different organizations, but I'm really glad to be here tonight. And that shows the reflection of this community. The one that no matter what organization it is, no matter who we are, it's the issues that we stand together in, through, and with. So thank you for having me here today. And I want to say a warm welcome to Miko, Peled. And again, you know, we've done this in Chicago before. And you know, I want to say this usually, well, when he speaks, you'll know that I feel I have to speak on behalf of the Jewish side. So I'm giving you a little introduction, I guess, to his work. Because the last time I felt for the presentation to be balanced, I have to represent the Israeli, because he does such a great job, his life and passion and the work as a brother. One thing Miko and I have in common is that we were both born and raised in Jerusalem. You know, I was thinking of that the other day, and hearing about you coming and for this event, I was thinking, probably there was a time when we were both riding bikes, right, as little children, around each other. We must have passed some restaurants, and we must have walked the same streets at one point. It's our home. And the one thing about home is family. You know that it's your family. You don't always agree with your family, but it doesn't make you less of a family. The one thing, when we speak on issues of justice and equality, I think today, when we talk about our own administration in the United States, or we talk about certain political officials who have not fulfilled their duties or jobs, it doesn't make any of us less of an American. The same thing, I would say that when someone speaks against the oppression that their own government is doing, such as what goes on at times with the Israeli occupation, bad leadership. When you speak against bad leadership, not making the right calls, and as a result having many lives being sacrificed, it doesn't make you less of a Jew or an Israeli or anybody else. I think it's important for us as people of faith to speak, and I know Imam Mardini, graciously as a close brother that I treasure as well, you know, has said that this conflict is 66 years old and so forth, but I want to challenge you to think this way. I really think it's no longer 66 years old, but over 3,400 to 3,500 years old. And the land that we know, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, that word which means city of peace, that's originally what the name means when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about the Holy Land, we talk about Gaza. It's very interesting, some of the early records actually in history when we hear about Gaza. We hear about the record, 12th century BC or so, of the Philistines. And the ongoing conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. Now, remember again, although Philistine sounds very close, as a matter of fact, in Arabic, Philistine, the word is very close to those people who were called the sea people, who had come from the side of the sea coast, from the Mediterranean Sea, and they have established themselves. And if you look at the history, even there is history beyond biblical records that show this conflict, the ongoing struggle between the Philistines and the Israelites, and just been on and on and on. As a matter of fact, later on, for those of you who know some Old Testament history and you hear about the kingdoms of Israel and you hear about the rulers, you continue to hear about this relationship and these fights. That land is nothing new to fight. Some people today say, look, it's the end of the world. I actually had people last week telling me, is the world coming to an end? Look what's happening. Look what's happening in Gaza. Look what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. Look. And there are some televangelists, unfortunately, they cash in on this idea on people's emotions. Well, I have news for you. War is nothing new, right? The first crime in humanity, when we hear about parents getting killed by their own children, right? We hear about a son shooting his father. People say, wow, the world is coming to an end. The first crime that ever took place was between two brothers, Cain and Abel. That's even before there were people, right? Just with Adam and Eve, even in the history, in the biblical history, and even in Islam, even in Christianity. What's important when we come to look at this issue, in Gaza especially, I believe it's not an issue of Palestinian and Jewish, but rather, or Israeli. But I believe it is an issue, as Imam Mardini had touched on something when he talked about and the work of this organization, Relief, about the humanitarian aspect, it's something to do with our human identity, existence, and emotions. There's something about us as humans. We like to separate, segregate, and we like to distinguish one from the other, no matter what it is. For some, we call it religion. You are a Muslim. I'm a Christian. You are a Jew. We have to find titles, right? You're Hindu. You're Buddhist. For others, it's nationality. You're Lebanese. You're Iraqi. You're from this side. And then for those in the same place, well, you're from the south of Lebanon. I'm from the north. You are from Iraq. You're from Mosul. And then we find that no matter what it is, factions and groups, even when people find nothing, well, you are Republican, you are Democrat, you believe this, you believe that, and we get so passionate about such differences, right, that we stop seeing the other person, but rather look at the other person as what we disagree with. Part of the main issue for us, and this is, I believe, the issue really why it's ongoing in Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land, obviously is the issue of justice, right? Because what we cannot have people live in a way that doesn't reflect their humanity and integrity. But for us, we seem not to value, and generally speaking, of course, not us here gathered because we met today, but the way as humans we operate, we have to look at what is different than the other. Look at us in the metro area. We are the most segregated area in the whole nation, right? The most diverse, the most segregated. We like to cluster in groups. Why do you think Dearborn is now the largest Arab Middle Eastern concentration outside the Middle East? Why do you think Livonia is the widest city for 100,000 population? Why do you think Metro Detroit, Detroit City, is the second largest concentration of people of black color in the nation? Why do you think that we have such concentration of clustering? Because we say people of the same feather flock together. We like our own. So what we do when we add this concept of politics in Palestine and the Holy Land, how do we deal with it? Well, the way some have dealt with it is what? Build walls, right? Large walls. Set that solution so that we don't talk to Jewish people and Jewish people don't talk to Palestinians. Build walls and separate them from one another so they don't see each other. So the hate even grows further. Now the young generation, the children, are going with greater hatred for the other. And the only thing they see is the killing of one that is doing to the other. Yes, it is a human relation. It is an issue of integrity and human identity. The issue of Gaza, I believe, is the issue of Ferguson. It's the issue of Missouri. It is the issue of racial tension that still continues to exist because we cannot look at the other person but see the color. And what difference does it make what color you are? What difference does it make what nationality you are? What difference does it make what religion you are? When we look at Iraq and Mosul, and we look at the killing of the Christians by some radical groups that claim Islam as a religion, what difference does it make that you are a Christian that I have to kill you and send you out of the country? The issue of Gaza is an issue of justice that affects each and all of us. There's a philosophical argument that is called inductive generalization. In philosophy, we say that if X is equal to A, therefore all X are equal to A. If one Palestinian is a terrorist, all Palestinians are terrorists. If one Muslim is a fanatical radical out there to kill everybody else, and by the way, the Muslims that are killing Christians, I often tell people, it's not Muslims hate us as Christians. Because I get people that tell me, look what's happening in Iraq. Muslims hate us. I say, it's not Muslims that hate us. They are actually killing Muslims also. They are against human life. They are not against just the other person or the other religion. If X is equal to A, all X are equal to A, this is the premises, do not support the conclusion. This is called inductive generalization. It's an argumentative fallacy. For us, as people of faith, as we come today, we look at the world around us. The issue of Gaza is the issue of undocumented immigrants that are suffering in this country, over 9 to 12 million people. It is the issue of the refugees who are being separated from their families and loved ones. The issue of Gaza is the issue that we face, all of us, when we look at the other person and see nothing but race, religion, color, or nationality. Because this is what happened. Why is it that 2,000 lives have seemed to have no consideration to the outside world? We all heard about Carter. Up there, and we heard because of his U.S. citizenship, how all the world and the media covered him. And now 2,000 people, including some 500 children, are killed. And you know what? We can't even get back with full day. I think it is time for us to wake up and realize that not just to point fingers, and look what Israel is doing, but to point fingers not for the other, but to confess before God our sins. and say, look, we are also guilty. Because we are not able to love our neighbor as ourselves. When Jesus said, love God with your mind, heart, and soul, but love your neighbor as yourself. We are not able to love our own family members as ourselves. And it's time for us to recognize that we cannot do this on our own. That's why whether we are Muslims, Christians, or Jews, we need to go back to our roots and our divine heritage, where we come and cry to God and say, God, have mercy and compassion, so that we can finally love the other person, no matter what they look like, how they look like, what they believe, what language they speak, and how they walk and how they talk. Because what I believe for us here in this country, and I believe this is the greatest part about being an American and living the American dream, it's not buying a house with a 2-car garage, and it's not having a boat, and as I've been told lately, it's also having a dog. But really, the American dream is living, treating each and everyone with equality, and the pursuit of liberty, happiness, and justice, is looking at each one as a human being, regardless of their race, religion, and color, regardless of what they believe in, and standing out together for advocating for our sisters and brothers, no matter where they are in the world, no matter who they are, not fearing to be all gathered as one, knowing and realizing that the solution, and I often say it's not us to sign contracts and documents. We all like to kind of fulfill the destiny of people there, right? I like this when the whole world says, well, let's go discuss what's going on there. And you know what? We cannot control the future there, but I know that the solution starts with us. How we approach others in our life, and how we reach out to them, and how we take the stand. So I want to say, I add my prayers to that of my brother Imam Martin tonight, and to you and to all, as we pray for the victims and the families really who are suffering, losing loved ones. There is no reason why one child should be killed. I'm amazed always that it was how a hit or a sniper or a bullet that hits a Palestinian child in the head or the chest is called a random shot, right? I mean, snipers can't even get that shot that accurate. There is no reason why a child should have to suffer as such, or their families as such. And I want to say this because also I know Miko Peled on a personal level, that I know no Jew or Israeli should have to lose also their loved ones or their children just by a random suicide bomber, because life is precious. It's not for us to take away. God has given that life. It is for us to promote equality, integrity, and respect of this human life, no matter who's behind it. So may God bless you and strengthen you, and thank you for that.
Father, from your mouth to the halls of Washington, I would like now to introduce to you a gentleman who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, someone that I'm just honored to be at the table with, someone that I feel has really graced us with his presence, and I feel we are all very blessed tonight to hear his words. I would like to rightfully call upon Mr. Nafi Abunab, who really does not need an introduction, but a passionate individual, an activist, and someone who I think is really mostly responsible for all of us being here this evening. Nafi Abunab, activist, photographer, and wonderful community member.
Now, what a wonderful MC. Let's give her a good big hand. Fate has it that I should come here and have the honor to introduce Mr. Miko Peled. In fact, when I was talking to Mr. Osama Sablani, he said there is no person that I admire more in the world than Mr. Miko. I want to introduce him. So he was scheduled to introduce Mr. Miko Peled, but he is stuck now doing the newspaper, as you all know, which is the voice of the Arab American community. So he sends you his regards. Now, I'm very lucky and privileged and honored to be the one to introduce a person that does not need much introduction. You probably all met him or knew about him such a great conviction that he makes it quite a popular thing to be Palestinian. He makes us proud to be Palestinians. He makes it a privilege to be Palestinian. Today when Dr. Al-Jabour met him, he said, "Oh, you're more Palestinian than I am." His story, he will tell it to you. There is no person that has done more for the Palestinian cause in the recent past than the person who is the keynote speaker of this evening. We are so lucky and privileged to have among us today Mr. Miko Peled. I'd like you all to give him a big, dear-born welcome and a big standing ovation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Miko Peled, at your proceedings.
Thank you all very much. I think for my height, this is actually perfect. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Nafi, for that introduction. And you did an amazing job putting this together. Nafi wrote to me less than 2 weeks ago about the possibility of putting this event together, coming to speak here. And here we are, the hall's almost full. There's sponsors, there's an organization. That's remarkable. So thank you very much for that. I met Dr. Nizal today as well and his family, so thanks for picking me up. It was a pleasure to meet you too. It's also wonderful to see so many children here. So thank you all for bringing your children. It's always, it adds so much to see, to see kids at events like this that are usually too serious and too somber. Kids always add a dimension that's sorely missing from these things. I was also really glad to hear Imam Adini and Father Ali speaking about our common humanity, because I think that is another aspect, first of all, that we are reminded of by seeing the children, but it's another aspect of I think, not just this conflict, but many conflicts that we often forget, our common humanity. And it's nice to hear people of faith, men of faith, remind us of that. It's so important because we do get caught up in our differences and we forget our common humanity. If anybody's tweeting today, any of the young people are tweeting, please use the hashtag Zionism must go. That's been the hashtag that I've been using for some time. So, on the issue of Gaza, there's so much to say. I think over the last few weeks, we've all been witnessing horrifying lynching. Just an unbelievable bloodletting and a massacre that is impossible to describe in words. It's been happening in front of us on our TV screens. It's being broadcast on televisions in Europe, here in the US, all the news channels in Israel. I was just there. I only got back about 2 weeks ago. And people just watch it and let it happen. And what makes it so difficult is that we can see it, we understand it, and we are helpless. And in this country, actually, we're even paying for it. We're actually paying for this massacre. So we're not only watching it and feel helpless and doing anything about it, but we are actually paying for it. And I think it's time to connect what is happening in Gaza today, or what's been happening in Gaza in the last few weeks, with the entire history of the last 6-7 decades of Palestine. And I agree with Imam Adini about this issue. What is happening in Gaza today cannot be separated and isolated from what has been happening in Palestine over the last 7 decades. It is a big part of that. And what Israel tries to do, and what the United States tries to do, and what the media tries to do, is portray Gaza as something that's isolated. And I'm going to go through a little bit of history here just to kind of put things back in perspective. I'm sure many of the things that I say are known to many of you. But I think it's important because it puts things back in perspective. There's this impression out there, and this is, I think, the success of the Israeli PR and the media here in the U.S., that we have a conflict between two countries. That there's a Palestine and that there's an Israel. Palestine is a little bit vague. Some of it is Gaza and Hamas. Some of it is not Hamas. It's a little confusing, but it creates this impression that there are actually two countries that are at war. And what we need are peace talks, and we've been working on these peace talks for several decades now, but for some reason these people over there can't put it together. They can't get it together. And this goes along also with this idea that the conflict over there, those people over there have been killing each other for centuries, for thousands of years. Of course, none of this is true. Palestine is not two different countries. Palestine and Israel are the same country. Palestine is not just Gaza or the West Bank. Palestine is also Jaffa, it's the Galilee, it's Nazareth, it's Jerusalem, it's the Negev Desert. It's all Palestine. We don't have two states there, we don't have two countries there. We have one country, one government, one military force, and two people. And it just so happens that this one government and one military force represents only one of the people. So the issue here is not two countries at war that require peace agreement and peace talks. This is a story of oppression and occupation which requires a struggle for freedom and independence. It's an entirely different paradigm. It's an entirely different issue. It's a lot more like the story in South Africa, where what was needed and what actually took place was there was a concerted anti-apartheid effort. It took a long time to bring together, but eventually brought down apartheid. And the argument that I made is what is needed now is a concerted anti-Zionist effort to bring about the change from the Zionist regime in Palestine to a real democracy that represents everyone who lives there. And until we are able to say this, and until we are able to educate people about this issue, people will continue to think that there's an equality here between the two sides. The reality is, of course, there's only been one army there forever. There's never been a Palestinian army. There's never been a Palestinian tank. And it's very interesting because the impression that is being created is that Israel is being threatened by Gaza. That Israel is under some kind of a military threat, or an existential threat even. Israel is a state with a huge army. In Gaza, there's never been a tank. In Gaza, there's never been a regular army. There's never been a warplane or a warship. But what Gaza does is threaten not the state of Israel's security. What Gaza does is it threatens the legitimacy of the state of Israel. The reality in Gaza reminds all of us, not that we here in this room need to be reminded, but people around the world, and it reminds Israelis of the original sin of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And the difference between life in Gaza and life in cities that are perhaps no more than a mile or two away from Gaza, inside of Israel, is a constant reminder that Israel is an illegitimate creation, born of a union, an unholy union between racism and colonialism. And this is why Gaza is being attacked. This is why Gaza is being punished. Not because it poses a threat, a security threat or a military threat, but because it poses a threat to the legitimacy of Israel, and it reminds people that Israel is an illegitimate creation. Now, people often... Can somebody go and hit that thing for me? Oh, there it is. Okay, I got it. People often like to talk about the history. Like I said, there's this idea out there that this conflict has been going on for thousands of years. Those people over there just can't get along. So I like to remind people that, first of all, this is not true. Like I said, I don't need to tell anybody in this room that this is not true. But I think if you want to talk about the beginnings of this conflict, we have to remember a time where white Europeans felt that they could take the countries of people who felt they were inferior to them and give it away and divide it and do as they will. I'm sure you've all heard of the Balfour Declaration. In Israel, almost every city has a Balfour Street or a Balfour Declaration Plaza. And Israelis and people who support the state of Israel talk about the Balfour Declaration as though it was one of the 10 Commandments, as though it came down with Moses from the Mount Sinai. But what was the Balfour Declaration? It was Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister of Great Britain, promising a friend of his, Lord Rothschild, who was a Jewish millionaire, Palestine as a homeland. One white racist offering another white racist somebody else's country. This is what the Balfour Declaration is. Who is he to promise anybody anything? This is what the Balfour Declaration is all about. But when you talk to Israelis, they talk about it like, or people who support the state of Israel, as though this is one of the 10 Commandments, the Balfour Declaration. And then we move forward several decades, and we have what this map represents on the screen, which is the partition plan. And if you notice carefully, if you look carefully, you'll see it says the partition of Palestine. Because we often hear that there was no such thing as Palestine. Well, it's called the partition of Palestine. And the idea was the United Nations thought, well, the Jews want some of it, the Arabs want some of it, we'll divide it between the two. Very simple. What's interesting, however, is this. The partition plan came about at the end of November 1947. At that time, the Jewish community in Palestine numbered about 500,000 people. These were my grandparents' generation who immigrated there, mostly from Eastern Europe, and my parents' generation who were born there. That was the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. The Palestinian community, which were the native indigenous people of Palestine, numbered 3 times as many, about 1.5 million. Yet the partition plan gives the Jewish community the larger portion of the country. And somehow people thought this was going to work, and even today you hear people say, well, you know what? The fact that the conflict is still going on is actually the Palestinians' fault, because they rejected the partition plan. Would anybody not reject a plan like this? Can you imagine not rejecting a plan that takes your country and gives a larger portion of it to somebody else? Really a community of immigrants who almost just really came off the boat. And if you look at the map, you will see the Gaza Strip created already with the whole extension going along the border with the Sinai Peninsula. All of this was later changed when Israel conquered the rest of the country. But what's interesting is this. If we look at this point in history when this partition plan was proposed or passed, it's not only important to understand that this is what took place, but also in terms of, from this point on, we have 2 narratives, opposing narratives that emerge. We have 2 opposing histories that emerge. Completely opposite, diametrically opposed. And when people look for some kind of a moderate solution, some kind of a bridge between the 2, they can't find one, because there isn't one. When you have 2 histories that are completely opposed to each other, there cannot be any way to bridge them. Only one of them can be true. Now we have one story, the story that I grew up upon as an Israeli, and the story upon which most people in America and the West learn, and that is a story of heroism. The story of the Jews coming out of the Holocaust and coming back after 2,000 years of exile. The few defeating the many, defeating the Arabs who tried to kill and attack them, and even though they were fewer and perhaps less equipped and so forth, they were able to defeat the Arabs like David defeated Goliath, and once again establish a Jewish state in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. It's a story that sounds so heroic, once again, it sounds like it came out of the Bible. Who would want to not believe a story that's so wonderful? Once again, David beating Goliath, the Maccabees defeating great empires, and so on. The other story, as we know it, of course, the story the Palestinians have been telling for decades, and over the last several decades, Israeli historians have been validating, is that this was no story of heroism at all. It was a story of terrorism and ethnic cleansing. And the question that is asked is, when we look at the two communities, the Jewish community had developed by 1947 a very strong armed militia. My father was an officer in that militia. The Zionist militia by 1947 numbered close to 40,000 well-armed, well-trained men. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So when people say the Arabs attacked the Jews, who were exactly these Arabs that attacked, and what did they attack with? Arab armies didn't intervene in Palestine until 6-7 months later. And even they were defeated quite easily by the Zionist militia. So who attacked? Who are these Arabs? What did they attack with? And this is exactly what Ilan Pape and some other historians have been asking, and they came out with a book and the research that validates what Palestinians have been saying. Between the end of 1947 and the end of 1948, there was a massive 12-month-long terrorist attack that was conducted with the intention of completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And this is connected to Gaza because if there was no ethnic cleansing of Palestine, if there were no refugees, there would not have been a Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip was created in order to house the hundreds of thousands of refugees from the southern part of Palestine. If there was not this original crime of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, there would have been no problem in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of refugees moving into refugee camps around the city of Gaza and then enclosed in the Gaza Strip. And from the very creation of the Gaza Strip, which really was finalized in the early 50s, the ethnic cleansing and so forth continued several years after the State of Israel was established. From that very first moment, Israeli army, Israeli forces began attacking the refugees in Gaza. From the early 50s, all the way till this day, on a regular basis, consistently, the Israeli army has been conducting massacres in the Gaza Strip. The technology improves, the weapons improve, so of course the body count grows with every decade. In the 50s, they were called infiltrators. Then after that, they were called Fida'im. Then after that, they were called Fatah. Then after that, they were called something else. Today, we're Hamas. Every decade, the name of the devil that lives in Gaza changes. But Israel finds a reason and an excuse to go and attack Gaza every time. Not because there's a security threat, because there's never been an army there. There's never been a security threat. It's because it threatens the legitimacy of the creation of the so-called Jewish state. And none of this would have happened, and none of this would have been a problem had there not been the original sin, the original crime of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Now, I don't need to tell you this, but somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million people were forced out of their homes between the end of 47 and the end of 1948. Over 500 towns and villages were destroyed. And what's interesting is that often we hear people talk about this and they say, well, first of all, they say there was no Palestine. But then after that, they say, well, perhaps there was. Can we maybe move this poster a little bit so that I can reach my thing? I can't. Just hit the arrow. There we go. Thank you. Okay. So people say, well, maybe there was a Palestine, but really there was nothing in Palestine. It was just some poor farmers and some primitive tribes, and there was really nothing there. So there's no big deal, even if it was destroyed. So I like to show this picture of Jaffa from a picture before 1948. So I'm sure many of you know this here, being Palestinian, but Jaffa was a city of close to 120,000 people. There were several newspapers printed in Jaffa. There was a rich business life, a rich political life, trade unions, writers' guilds, concert halls, movie theaters. Some of the biggest names in the Arab world would come and perform in Jaffa. And in a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, the city of Jaffa was destroyed and reduced from 120,000 to less than 4,000, concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli soldiers surrounding them. And on the very ashes of Jaffa, you can hit the thing again for me, please. Is there? I need the next slide. Thank you. And on the very ashes of the city of Jaffa, we now have the Israeli city of Tel Aviv. And there's still a small part of Jaffa. Tel Aviv calls itself Tel Aviv. And there's still a small part of Jaffa. There's still a small Palestinian community in Jaffa. Oppressed, neglected, subject to harassment by the Israeli security forces, even though they are Israeli citizens. Now again, this is important not just to tell the story, this is important because put it in context. This attempt to create the impression that Palestine is the West Bank and Gaza. Palestine is not just the West Bank and Gaza, Palestine is also Jaffa, like I said, in Jerusalem, and the Galilee and so forth. And the life of Palestinians, though in the West Bank it's governed by military law, and inside in Jaffa and in what's considered Israel, it's governed by civil law, but it's basically the same life: neglect, oppression, and harassment by security forces. Israeli civil law has dozens and dozens of racist laws that discriminate specifically against the Palestinian population, what they call the non-Jewish population, and of course in the West Bank they're subject to military law. But it's the same reality. And again, it's important to put this back in context and to put Palestine back together, as it were, from decades of Israeli efforts to separate. Can you hit the next slide, please? Thank you. So today we have a refugee problem. Over 4 million refugees, or 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps. Now you're never going to find Israeli children anywhere looking like this. You're never going to find a single Israeli neighborhood or a single Israeli city where there's no running water that's fit for drinking, there's no basic medicine, there's a lack of medicine, there's a lack of food, there's no electricity. You have a reality that looks like this, a mile away from modern Israeli cities that look like this. And this is before the bombing. This is regardless of the bombing. The tragedy is not only that people live like this, the tragedy is that this is a mile away from complete modern cities and modern facilities. Not to have proper health care where you live a mile away from modern health facilities inside of Israel. This reality exists for the Palestinians in refugee camps only because they're Palestinians, only because Israel will not permit them to return to their homes, and only because we as American taxpayers are paying for this to continue. We are paying for this reality to be maintained every single day. $3-4 billion every single year go to Israel to maintain this reality, to keep Palestinians in refugee camps. Imagine as a parent when a child has an ear infection and you have no access to antibiotics. Never mind the bombing. Think of the simple day-to-day stuff. And this goes on under our watch every single day in one of the highest profile places in the world, in broad daylight. And again, never mind the bombing that's been going on a regular basis. Every so often, the day-to-day life is horrifying enough. Can we get the next slide, please? Thank you. So people often ask me, I was born and raised in a very patriotic Israeli family. As my book suggests, I'm the son of an Israeli general. I'm also the grandson of one of the founders of the State of Israel, a man who signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. So I grew up with this very patriotic Israeli, very patriotic Zionist upbringing. And so people often ask, well, how do I end up with this perspective? And it's a process, obviously. And there's a story that I often tell, I like to tell about my mother. And I talk about it in the book as well. And my mother was born and raised in Jerusalem. By the way, she turned 88. She still lives there. She turned 88 just 2 days ago. And this picture, she's about 22. And in 1948, this is from then, from around that time, she was already a mother. She was living in a small apartment with her parents and my older siblings. And in 1948, the Zionist forces came and took the Palestinian neighborhoods of West Jerusalem, what later on became the Israeli side of Jerusalem. Now these neighborhoods are still there. I'm sure many of you may know what I'm talking about. And the homes are still there, but of course the Palestinians, the families were forced to leave. And when the Zionist forces came and forced into exile the Palestinian communities, the homes were made available to Israeli families. And my mother was offered one of these homes. And she refused. And the way she told the story when I was a boy, and she still talks about it in fact, is with great passion. She says, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I move into the home of another family that now has to live in exile and imagine how much they must miss their home. And these are beautiful, very distinct Jerusalemite Palestinian homes. And then she would go on to talk about how when the Israeli soldiers came in, the coffee was still warm on the table. And then they began the looting, because these are well-to-do neighborhoods, well-to-do families. So the rugs and the furniture and rare books that were stolen. There's a documentary actually about the rare books that were stolen and so on. And now, of course, this is an excellent story, and it's, you know, it makes us all proud. Certainly my family, that my mother did what she did, and think of it, she's only 22, so it is quite remarkable. Sadly, not many other people did that. Most people did take the homes. But for me, there was a serious problem. This story actually posed a serious problem. And I wasn't really able to understand what the problem was until I was working on the book over the last few years. And I realized the problem is that her story contradicts the national narrative. The national narrative, the Zionist narrative, is morally perfect. And here she was presenting a moral dilemma. According to the Zionist narrative, the narrative that I grew up upon, which I was educated, first of all, this is our land because we're Jews. And all of us Jews around the world are the descendants of an ancient tribe that lived in that part of the world some 2,000-3,000 years ago, the ancient Hebrews. So we were forced into exile some 2,000 years ago, and now we're back. It's our country, and we've returned. And the issue of return is a very big part of what Zionism is all about. Now we've returned, and we agreed to the partition plan because we're nice people and we thought the Arabs deserve a little bit of their country as well. And they rejected it. And then they attacked us. Thankfully, we're better equipped, we're smarter, so we beat them. And then we asked them to stay and they left. And this is a big part of the Zionist story. We asked them to stay, we begged them in fact to stay, and they left. So a family leaves the home. A family needs a home. Where's the moral dilemma? There's an empty home that was left, and there's a family needs a home. Why was she presenting a moral dilemma? And like I said, I was carrying this for many, many years. And in fact, the Zionist narrative is so morally perfect that even when we do discuss atrocities, it still turns out okay. So for example, the massacre of Deir Yassin is taught in Israeli schools. I remember learning it as a boy, I know they still teach it. Deir Yassin, if you don't know, is a small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. When the Zionist forces came, they surrendered, the village surrendered, and the forces came and committed a terrible massacre. So we learn about this in school, but we also learn in the same chapter, in the same lesson, that important Zionist leaders told us, or said, that while the massacre was a terrible thing, thankfully, as a result of the massacre, thousands and thousands of Arabs fled, which allowed us to establish a Jewish majority. And we all know, and this does not need to be said, we all know that there's nothing more important than establishing a Jewish majority. Talk about education for racism. There's nothing more important than establishing a Jewish majority in the land of Israel. And it goes on today. Every Israeli knows that Israel is murdering women and children and innocent civilians in Gaza. It's on the TV screens. I was just there. Every news channel shows it. Every news broadcast talks about it. They know the numbers. They know the age of the children. They know how many mosques and hospitals and so forth were destroyed. Everybody knows this. But it's okay. Because Hamas is in Gaza and Hamas is the devil. So it's okay. It's not our fault. Even through the atrocities, the Zionist narrative always comes up, at least in its own mind, as morally on top. And this was the same then, it is the same again today. Oh, thank you. So the next slide is just a map of what Palestine looked like after 1948. Basically, Israel occupied almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and Gaza. 1967 came around, and can you hit the next one please for me? And in 1967, basically, Israel erased Palestine off the map completely and established a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people. Now, they call it a Jewish state. I don't believe there's anything Jewish about the state of Israel. But it offers exclusive rights to Jewish people. Now, most Jewish people don't live there. The majority of people who do live there are not Jewish. Out of 12 million people, 5.9 million are Israeli Jews. So the majority of people who live there are not Jewish. The state of Israel does not espouse any Jewish values that I can think of. Having thousands of political prisoners does not espouse Jewish values. Denying children water because they're Palestinian does not espouse Jewish values. Bombing and killing innocent civilians on a regular basis as a policy does not espouse Jewish values. And having racist laws that discriminate people who are Jews and non-Jews is certainly not Jewish value. So I don't know what to do with the state of Israel, except that they give exclusive rights to Jewish people. Now again, this is not just important for a history lesson. I think it's important to see this in context of what is happening in Gaza today and this whole nonsense, 2 decades long peace process. This notion of a two-state solution. This notion that there could be an Israeli government that would allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the land of Israel. It's all the land of Israel that belongs to the Jewish people. There is no Zionist government in the world, and never will be, that will allow itself to compromise on the issue of the land, that will allow a Palestinian state to ever emerge. You have to be hallucinating to believe that that is possible. As soon as the West Bank was taken in 1967, as soon as the West Bank was taken, not a year later, 2 years later, 6 months later, immediately, on the 5th day of the Six-Day War, Israeli bulldozers were already destroying Palestinian neighborhoods. Israeli army trucks were already forcibly pushing into exile hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank. Immediately, and immediately began massive building of cities and towns and industry and neighborhoods for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank. What they did after 1948 in the rest of Palestine, they did after 1967 in the West Bank, and to them this was finishing the job. A job they wanted to finish for a very long time, which was taking the West Bank, and including the state of Israel, including the West Bank inside the state of Israel. This was not done by mistake. Decades and decades of ethnic cleansing and building for Israeli Jews in the West Bank was not done by mistake. One of the very first commands given by the Israeli army after the occupation of the West Bank was that the water in the West Bank belongs to the state of Israel. You know, the mountain aquifer runs in the West Bank. It's one of the largest sources of water in the country. None of this was done by mistake, and certainly not in order to give it back or to give it to somebody else. This was done because in terms of Zionist thinking, the entire country is the land of Israel. There is no Palestine. There is no possibility. There wasn't, there isn't today, and I can tell you clearly there never will be a possibility that a Zionist government will allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. And I think it's very important to understand this in terms of what is happening today and to realize that the West Bank was not taken by mistake. Okay, we're back. Okay, the next picture. This picture is a picture of my father while still in uniform. So he was a young officer in 1948 when the state of Israel was established and the Israeli army was established. He remained as an officer. By 1967, he was a general. He was one of the members of the Israeli Army High Command. In fact, he was one of the voices that pushed very hard for Israel to start the war of 1967. But he did something very interesting. As soon as the war was over, the very first meeting of the Israeli High Command, he stood up and he said, we must now allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank and Gaza. We must recognize the right to self-determination of the Palestinians. If we don't do this, then we will destroy our own Jewish state by including millions of Palestinians in this Jewish state. He said if we don't allow the Palestinians to establish a state now, we will become an occupying power. There will be a resistance. We will have to use all of our resources to fight this resistance, and eventually we're going to become a binational state. It's exactly what happened in the last 5 decades. Every word he said came true. And like I said, as he was saying these very words, deeply intending to protect the Jewish state and the Zionist idea of a Jewish state, the Israeli government was already conducting the destruction of Palestinian towns and the building of what they call settlements. These are not settlements, these are big cities for Israelis only in the West Bank. Can you hit the next one, please? One more slide. Okay, one more, please. Yeah. Now, we hear over and over again, and we've heard this not only the last 2 decades, some of us are old enough to remember from even before that Israel wants peace, but there's no one to talk to. The Palestinians are terrorists, the Palestinians want to destroy us, Israel does not want peace. Now, after my father retired from the army a year after the 1967 war, and he continued and dedicated the rest of his life to promoting this idea of an Israeli-Palestinian peace based on what we know today is the two-state solution. That was when the idea really began to emerge in the late 60s, early 70s. He and several other Israelis who were like-minded established an organization that was dedicated to this end, and they were contacted, this is in the mid-1970s, they were contacted by major figures within the PLO, Yasser Arafat's top aides, top people, in order to start a discussion to talk about this idea of a two-state solution as opposed to the return of all of Palestine to Palestinian hands. Now, they began, and in this picture, oh, go back, where are you going? That's it. In this picture, my father is with the Dr. Issam Sartawi, who was the Palestinian representative in Paris for many, many years, and one of Yasser Arafat's aides. And so they would meet, in the beginning it was all secret, they would meet in European capitals, they would meet in North Africa, and whenever they returned, my father would go and report to the Prime Minister. He had that kind of access to them in those days. The Israeli government wanted nothing to do with this. In the 1980s, they actually met with Yasser Arafat publicly in Tunis. The press was there, it was a highly publicized meeting, and shortly after that, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that made it illegal for those people to be with the PLO. They passed a law specifically for them, saying it's illegal for them to be with the PLO. This was the 80s. Then suddenly 1993 rolls around, and we have the Oslo peace process, the Oslo peace accord. And many people thought this was sincere. After all, the Berlin wall had fallen, apartheid in South Africa had fallen, so it's Palestine's turn now. And many people thought that this was a sincere attempt to bring about peace. What people don't realize quite often is this. By 1993, there was no longer a possibility to establish a Palestinian state because there was no more West Bank. The West Bank was fully integrated into Israel. The reason Rabin initiated and signed, or I should say agreed and signed the Oslo Accords, was to bring the Palestinians to surrender, to strengthen Israeli stronghold over Palestine, over its people, and over the resources. Rabin was not a man of peace. Rabin saw this as an opportunity to get Arafat to surrender. And what we see today are the exact results of the Oslo process. People say Oslo failed. You can only think Oslo failed if you think that Oslo was meant to bring peace. But Oslo was not meant to bring peace. Oslo was an astounding success. Life for Palestinians is far, far worse than it was then. And it's a result of the Oslo process. Israeli hold of the land, of the resources, the building of cities and towns in the West Bank has all been strengthened thanks to the Oslo peace process, so-called peace process. It's neither a peace or a process, but this is what they call it. And you often hear people say, oh, you know, if Rabin would not have been killed, if Rabin had not been assassinated, it would have made no difference whatsoever, because this is exactly what Rabin and his people wanted. To destroy Palestine more, to create more fragmentation among Palestinian society and Palestinian political life. And they succeeded. And Rabin, by the way, was not assassinated because of the peace process. He was assassinated, I think, for other reasons. I won't get into that right now. So I think this is important to remember. Israel has shown absolutely no sign ever in its 66, 67 years that it has any desire to make peace with the Palestinians. It has no sign that it intends ever to allow the Palestinians to establish a state in any part of the country. In fact, they've done everything they could to deny that. And I think this is important in the run-up to report to remember. And when they attack the Palestinians, they always make it look like it's their fault. Like I said, in Gaza, Hamas is there, so we have to kill innocent people. Okay, go ahead to the next one. Now, one of the demands made by the Palestinians in Gaza for the ceasefire is the release of prisoners. They want the end of the siege, they want the ability to build a seaport and an airport, and they want to free the prisoners. Now, I'm sure you know about the prisoners, but generally people do not know about the existence of thousands and thousands of prisoners in Israeli jails. Another thing that often people don't know is that even though Israel calls them terrorists, the vast majority of Palestinians in Israeli jails have never been charged with acts of violence. This is according to Israeli sources. the vast majority of Palestinians, of the thousands and thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails, have not been charged with acts of violence. Now consider this. This is according to Israeli military law. Israeli military judicial system where the bar is set very, very low. And even they could not charge them with acts of violence. The vast majority are political prisoners. In this picture is Samir Isawi and his sister. You may recall Samir Isawi holds the record for the longest hunger strike ever. It was a miracle that he didn't die, that he survived it. And the reason there was a hunger strike is because he and hundreds of others are detained under administrative detention. In other words, even the military courts could find nothing to charge them with, and still they arrested them. And there are hundreds of them, including women and minors. And Samar eventually was released. Now he's back in prison, as is his sister, who was an attorney and an activist from Jerusalem. Now, besides all of that, we have to remember that the world recognizes the rights of oppressed people to resist. And you can read what it says on the screen. This is part of a UN resolution. It's a reaffirmation of an older resolution that talks about the legitimacy of people's struggle for liberation from colonial and foreign and alien domination, which is exactly what Israel is, by all available means, including armed struggle. If Israel does not like rockets coming out of Gaza, Israel can free Gaza. Israel can release the people in Gaza. Israel can lift the siege. Israel can rebuild. Israel can allow the refugees to return to their homes. It's very easy to always blame the oppressed for resisting. But the rockets coming out of Gaza are not just coming out because of God knows what. It's not an act of nature. There is a resistance to a brutal occupation and oppression. And of course, I think it's important to state, as we see reflected in the prisoner population, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance to Zionism has been unarmed. The armed resistance gets all the news, but the vast majority of resistance has been unarmed, and it's the same thing today. And to criticize Palestinian resistance today, I think, is unconscionable. We hear people who are considered, activists of peace and so forth, criticizing different aspects of Palestinian resistance, criticizing BDS, the call for boycott of Israel. We criticize BDS because it's this, we criticize Hamas because it's this. If you don't like resistance, it's very simple. We can end the resistance tomorrow by ending the oppression and ending the occupation of Palestine. Criticizing BDS, criticizing Hamas, criticizing everything that's in between, which is a very large body of resistance, like I said, most of which is not armed, is unconscionable. The resistance is not the problem. The oppression and the occupation is the problem. And that's where we need to focus our attention. And like I said, the world, the international community, we as people recognize the rights of people to resist when they're being oppressed and when they're being occupied. Okay, go ahead and hit the next one, please. So another aspect of my story, which will perhaps shed some light on how it is, again, that I ended up with the perspective that I do, has to do with my sister's little girl was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997. Now, this is her. She was 13 years old. Now, you can imagine this is very big news whenever there's an attack like that. In the days that there were attacks like that, they ended a long time ago. This is, of course, very big news. In this case, it was bigger news because this was the granddaughter of a famous general who had also dedicated his life to become known as an advocate for Palestinian rights. I was living in the U.S. at the time. I took the first plane home. When I reached my sister's apartment in Jerusalem, it was packed with people who came to mourn and express their sorrow, both Palestinian and Israeli, and with members of the press. There was press, every press agency that you can imagine, every language under the sun. Every country under the sun came to cover this. And when my sister came out to start answering questions, the questions are always, first of all, how many of them do we kill, and how do we show them, and how do we punish them, and so forth, and then who's responsible. And her first remark was, first of all, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. Second thing she said, in terms of who's responsible, she said, who is it that is taking Palestinian land, destroying Palestinian homes, throwing Palestinian fathers and brothers and mothers in jail, and shooting young Palestinians in their schools, and denying Palestinians the right to live. Who is doing all of this? It is we, the Israelis. It's the Israeli government that is doing all this, and this is the price that we pay. Do we really expect that we can maintain such a brutal occupation, such a brutal oppression, and there will not be a price to be paid? This is the price that you pay for maintaining this. And both she and her husband said very clearly they hold the Israeli government directly responsible for their daughter's death. And both of them and their three other sons, their three sons, have been very active ever since on this issue. In fact, my sister published a book about the racism in the Israeli education system. It's a very good book, you should check it out. So of course this became now even bigger news because we know that the Palestinians are terrorists and the Israelis are victims. We know that Israel wants peace and the Palestinians don't want peace. And suddenly here's this Israeli mother who just buried her daughter and she's turning the world upside down. Now I came back to the U.S. after the funeral and I felt my world was changed completely as well. This is a life-changing kind of experience. And of course the words of my sister's words were still echoing in my head. And I was very fortunate because in San Diego where I live, I found a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group. Now I was born and raised in Jerusalem most of my life after '67. And what is being portrayed as a united city. But the first time I met Palestinians was in the U.S. In fact, the chapter in the book that talks about my journey in Palestine begins with a line, my journey to Palestine began in San Diego. I was 39 years old. It was the first time I met Palestinians, even though I grew up in Jerusalem. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you know it's a very segregated, racist city. There's no opportunity for Israelis, certainly not youth, to meet with Palestinians. And not only was it the first time I met Palestinians, but it was the first time I was sitting with Palestinians in the same place, and we were equal. In other words, the laws that applied to me were the same laws that applied to them. That does not exist anywhere. Anywhere in Palestine. Not in the West Bank, not in Gaza, not in Jaffa, not in Jerusalem, not in the Galilee, not in the Negev Desert. There's not a single place in Palestine where Israelis and Palestinians live under the same laws. Of course, they like to call it a democracy. It's not. It's a truly apartheid regime. And for the first time, in fact, when I talked about this particular aspect, I was in South Africa a couple months ago, the people in South Africa understood exactly what I was talking about. This notion of living in a city that's supposedly mixed, but it's completely racist and segregated. And through this interaction with this very generous Palestinian community in San Diego, I was introduced to the Nakba, I was introduced to all of this whole other narrative, which I didn't know existed, and they helped me go through this. They really helped me go through this very painful process of realizing that your own story is not true. Well, first of all, that there is another story, and that out of the two stories, the one that's not true is mine. And having been raised in such a patriotic family, so many members of my family were part of the establishment of the State of Israel and its military, this was a very, very painful and very slow process. And then I began, traveling to the West Bank and traveling into Palestinian cities and communities all over Palestine and establishing my understanding of the reality that exists there. Can you get the next one, please? This is the last one. The way the book ends, and the way I'll end my remarks tonight, is we have to realize where we stand today, and if we are struggling, what is it that we're struggling to do? What does it mean, Free Palestine? When we say Free Palestine, I believe that Free Palestine is the right slogan. I also believe the right to add to it that Zionism must go. Because the problem in Palestine is Zionism, just like the problem in South Africa was the apartheid regime. People like to say they support the State of Israel here. We like peace, we believe in peace, but we support the State of Israel. So anybody who supports the State of Israel needs to come to terms with the fact that they're supporting a state that has thousands of political prisoners. It's supporting a state that denies people water because they're not Jewish. It's supporting a state that has laws that discriminate between Jews and non-Jews. It supports a state that on a regular basis, for almost 7 decades, has been murdering innocent civilians, not only in Gaza, but in Gaza particularly, and other parts as well, because they are Palestinians. And it's supporting a state that is a racist, colonialist, apartheid state. And if that's what people support, they just need to own up to it. We know that there were people in this country that supported apartheid in South Africa. Today, of course, they're hiding in some corner. They're not really proud to admit it anymore. But we know they were there. It was very hard to gather a strong anti-apartheid movement here in this country. And equally today, just the same, there are people who support the state of Israel. Just admit that you're supporting racism. Admit that you are a racist. Admit that you think it's okay to have a racist regime in Palestine. But there is another option. We have seen, only in my lifetime, we've seen fascism fall in Spain. We've seen dictatorship fall in Greece. Today it seems absurd to think of this. We've seen dictatorship fall all over Latin America. We saw the Berlin Wall fall, and we saw apartheid fall in South Africa, which is probably the closest comparison. There is a possibility. There is a possibility to create a real democracy with equal rights in Palestine. The thing that needs to be removed is the Zionist regime. Is this idea, this notion of the so-called Jewish state, which is not, like I said, Jewish at all. And I would argue that the chances for success in Palestine are far greater than any of the other examples that I gave. In Palestine, we have two communities that are highly educated. Even in Gaza, with all the difficulties, literacy rates are some of the highest in the world. Over 92% literacy rate in Gaza. I think Gaza has something like 8 universities. We have two societies that are highly educated, highly professional, have traditions of governing, have traditions of democracy. Palestinians, even in the prisons, even Palestinians in the prison, and I talk about this in my book, were able to establish democratic institutions, democratic procedures in order to pass resolutions, even though they couldn't communicate with each other in the different prisons. So there is a strong tradition of democracy on both sides. Certainly both sides have their own share of problems with corrupt regimes and so forth, and fanaticism. But the strength of the fanatics is always diminished when there's hope. Now, I don't need to tell anybody here what a beautiful country it is. Palestine is. Full of good people. Full of potential. But nothing will change. Nothing will change until all of us, and many others, align ourselves clearly, not just behind the slogan of a free Palestine, but understanding that a free Palestine has to mean the end of Zionism. A real free Palestine with equal rights for everybody who lives in Palestine. That should be the slogan. That should be what we talk about. And when we do this, then we will see, not we will see, but then people in Gaza and people in refugee camps will see and believe that when we say never again, we actually mean never again. Thank you all very much.